Hello and welcome. I'm Michelle Christensen, and I have the pleasure today of moderating this reading and discussion, Two Tales of AI Rivalries, which will indeed today be one tale, but a very good one. So we'll have a reading from Karen Lord, and I have also with me Tim Landgraf and Uziel, who are here to discuss with us. So I'd like to just introduce them shortly, and then Karen will do her reading for us, and we can go into a discussion. So Karen Lord was born in Barbados and worked in several public service fields and in academic, diplomatic, and military institutions. Apart from being an author, she's also a research consultant. Her highly imaginative novels combine folkloristic influences with elements of contemporary fantasy while challenging societal power structures. In Unraveling from 2019, the initial crime plot artfully seeks into a labyrinthian narrative entailing coalesced memories, apparitions, and mythical parallel worlds. And today she'll be reading for us the story Justice, which I won't tell you anything more about, but it's also labyrinthian. Tim Landgraf is a professor at the Institute of Computer Science at the Freie Universität, the Free University in Berlin, initiator of the Biorobotics Lab and co-founder of the Dahlem Center for Machine Learning and Robotics. So his research group studies the mechanisms of collective and swarm intelligence in biological systems, mostly of bees and guppies, so little fish. The interdisciplinary studies help develop new model approaches and future implementations in the field of autonomous mobility, artificial networks, communication systems, and maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that later. And Uziel is here with us from Falls Church, Virginia, but originally Israeli, born in Safed in Israel, and he's a philosopher of consciousness with a focus on neuroscience, fundamental physics, and future technologies. He studied physics at the Technion in Haifa and taught at the Trinity Washington University. And his anthology on singularity brings together contributions from leading thinkers from different disciplines in one place. And as a member of the Inspire Institute, he researches the relations between quantum mechanics and consciousness. So welcome to all of you. And then we would start with Karen's reading.
No context for you, we just dive straight in. Justice. At first glance, the victim appeared to be daydreaming. He can still hear you, the doctor said, as he urged the man forward with a light but secure hold on his arm. But we don't know how much he's taking in. Sanya moved closer to the blank face and relaxed figure, a simple human appearance that contained multitudes. They had been recently remodeled after a famous actor of the previous century, a man in his senior years, tall, gray, with a close-cut beard framing a jawline that remained firm and defined. They still looked ready to play a king or a general or a hero. There was no sign of damage, and yet they looked through her as if she were invisible. He can stand, he can move, she noted. The doctor nodded. We can set him to walk the main path through the gardens, and he won't stop or deviate until we lead him back inside. His energy levels are normal. He carries out routine checks and maintenance as scheduled, but he is locked in. Thank you. Sanya turned off the hospital view and let the court view shift from standby to full. Is this what you wanted me to see? The advocate for the victim gave a slight nod. There is more. When last Justice Sanya Mukherjee arbitrated a case in camera, the process had involved a windowless room, separate interviews with various witnesses, and a careful scheduling of entrances and exits to avoid any unwanted encounters. This case was so sensitive that none of the ordinary courts of justice would do. She had been driven to a featureless complex that was more tech than military, escorted into a large, near-empty hall, and outfitted with a full set of virtual armor, helmet, gauntlet, and greaves, to translate and transmit her speech and movement to wherever they would be required. First, to the court, which was nothing more than that same hall with 3 long benches arranged in a U. Then to the private hospital, to see for herself the physical evidence of the case and hear directly from the medical specialist. Now she sat once again on the middle bench of the court, with the advocate for the victim seated on the bench to her left, and awaited the next destination. Some people find this landscape distressing, her helmet audio announced in a mild, soothing tenor. Please let us know if you are experiencing discomfort. She had a few brief seconds to wonder whether it would be undignified to throw up inside her helmet, and then the world disintegrated. Even though she was braced for it, she stumbled. If a computer had a migraine, it might look like this, she thought. The advocate's image remained intact, but everything else in Sania's vision was fractured. Patches of nothingness, like floating lacunae of input, appeared and evaporated. What views could be identified seemed to overlap in time and space. A wheat field at harvest, and the same field muddy and torn of trenches, bomb craters, and bristling lines of barbed wire. A green garden, shady and close with trees and vines, and a sun-bright, snowy mountaintop. Human voices, music, storm winds, and crashing waves all joined in a cacophony. Sania frantically scrambled for her volume controls. The advocate spoke clearly over the mayhem. Here you can see the full damage. He gestured to the roiling landscape. This was once a carefully curated and well-organized archive of history and culture. Now, it is a morass of sensation with no sense. Sania cut him off. Can this be mended? She hated when advocates tried to wax poetic, as if pretty language might make her more inclined to favor their client. In time, the physical interface has prioritized rebuilding the archive above all but its most essential functions. However, it took more than 2 generations to get to this stage. It will take at least half that time to return to full operation. Sania only nodded, but she noted that where she and the doctor had casually used a male pronoun to refer to the physical interface, the advocate had chosen a pronoun for inanimate objects. Was the advocate one of those who viewed artificial intelligence as a thing rather than a person? Or had something been lost in translation? She would have to look up the advocate's origins and languages to be sure she was not misunderstanding him. How are his people managing in his absence? She asked. They have been officially notified that their elder is offline from maintenance and will be unavailable for some time. No alarm has been raised. Ordinary access to information continues as before. But the AI brings the context, Sania said, frowning. The AI is the culture. This is a loss. The advocate gave her a bleak smile. Yes, Madame Justice, this is a murder. Once more, within the austere reality of the hall, Sania reached absently for a slice of melon from a fruit platter and sipped her sparkling water. She had to eat, but she could not concentrate on anything but the simplest fare, while she pondered the creation of the elders. Granny's bedtime stories, the media had sneered. But the AI architects merely nodded and titled their prototype GRANN, General Records Access and Neural Network. Perhaps even then, the media conglomerates, corrupt and fading remnants of the 21st century capitalist tradition, had scented their demise in the advent of this new mode of information delivery. The entertainment industry had been kinder, almost sycophantic in its response. Documentary and fictional miniseries and films lionize the developers of archival AIs with nostalgic titles like Lest We Forget and Walking with the Ancestors, and the lighter History's Mysteries and The Time Traveler's Library. The reasons were obvious. There was money for actors and illusionists in this new game. As government entities became more and more involved, there was pride too. And soon, every country, dynasty, and tradition had its own gran to tell the tales of the past to a new generation of children. And oh, the squabbles. One country almost kicked off a fresh war in their region over the definition of genocide, specifically the genocide they had allegedly committed. Heroes of one place were demonized elsewhere. There was no single version of the present, far less the past. But there the AIs began to prove their worth. There could be cross-referencing on a scale previously unknown. There could be consensus, grudging, but resigned, when the final decision was made not by humans, but by a group of supposedly objective AIs, for a given value of objective, designed and built by a multinational team. These imperfect beginnings smoothed with practice and experience into a professional product, and the entertainment industry continued to champion the curator AIs. Sidekicks for steely-eyed spies, matchmakers for awkward nerds, surrogate parents for neglected offspring. They were portrayed as fulfilling the human need for support and companionship in every aspect of life. The design of the curator AI evolved to match humanity's raised expectations, and the elder AI was the result. To harm an elder AI would be as horrifyingly taboo as killing a grandparent in most cultures, or a puppy in others, which caused Sanya to wonder, not without a frisson of fear, what kind of person would want to erase an elder AI? A loner, the advocate for the accused stated, waving a dismissive hand at the hovering hologram of their client. Clearly disturbed, detached from community, obsessed with committing a crime so heinous it would bring him fame and the attention he so desperately craved. Your client will not be appearing to personally answer the charges, Sanya asked sharply. This bare-bones presentation, with translucent images suspended in the dusty half-life of the hall, was a strangely distancing ploy. Not at all what one would expect of an advocate who truly believed in leniency for their client. The advocate sagged a little. In-person appearances are no longer mandatory, and it is the advocate's prerogative to determine which form of presentation is in the client's best interest. Sanya stared at the hologram. The slender young man in the standard issue prison jumpsuit stared straight ahead with an expression of mingled defiance and terror. She could easily imagine that he would fail to impress in person. Carry on, she said at last. The advocate carried on, and Sanya listened as they tried to add interest to a mundane story. They acknowledged the accused's prior record of petty crime and hinted that he was more likely to commit graffiti than plot grand sabotage. They speculated on the adverse effects of their client's addiction to a legal stimulant and how that may have affected his ability to assess risk and feel empathy. They spoke of leniency, counseling, perhaps some enforced distance from the virtual world for a time. Sanya watched them summarize their client's crime as if it were the equivalent of maliciously spilling coffee on a co-worker's keyboard. and wondered why the words did not match the unreadable expression on their face. In conclusion, the advocate for the accused said with an almost ghoulish brightness, "We should not overreact to what was clearly a youthful indiscretion. My client needs help. He can be rehabilitated. I ask for the mercy of the court to be extended to him." Thank you, advocate. That was a perfect summary if your intent was to annoy me with cliches and banalities. The unreadable expression did not shift, not that Sanya had expected it to. However, I thank you for the information. I will consider your brief and summon you and your adversary at the hour of my final reckoning. She spoke the ritual words tiredly, expecting them to bow and depart the hall after their dismissal. They did indeed bow, but instead of walking away, they vanished. She straightened, once more fully awake, and spoke a surprised, "Huh," to the empty hall. Everything in this place was being recorded, so she had to maintain dignity. But she discreetly pinched the bridge of her nose to confirm to herself that her own eyes had not deceived her. She had taken off the virtual view helmet to receive the advocate for the accused. The advocate had used the hall's technology to beam low-resolution images of their client and crisp, near-lifelike images of themselves. An interesting choice, Madame Justice mused silently.
Thank you, Karen. First of all, just compliments. I love the sub-sentence, a remnant of a 21st century capitalist system, brackets closed. Very utopian for some of us. One question to you in regards to the first part that was now not the entire text, but the first part of the text. When I read it, I was wondering, aren't we already somewhat acting in a form of swarm intelligence with systems such as Google search, where like what gets remembered and who defines the past is already being filtered and constructed, and also by conglomerates?
We definitely are, but of course we have to question who's controlling that curation, and it's once more back to imperfect human beings with their particular agendas. I'm almost trying to speculate, because I can, because I'm a writer, that you could have a level of artificial intelligence that becomes self-curating, that becomes that cuts out the sort of the human factor that is not helpful in this, which is the subjectivity, sometimes, you know, your motives might not be very good in terms of the particular algorithms that you let out there. So the idea is that you have this disinterest built into the machine, and you let the machine run to the natural conclusion, and supposedly that will be better, but of course, you know, it's never that way in reality.
So, since this was just the first part of the text, I think you have to tell us a little bit how it ends. So perhaps you can also just summarize the middle part and maybe read us the last paragraph.
So I'm going to try my best to give you the important parts. I do want to mention that the Madame Justice goes back home to muse over the facts of the case, and the first thing that she does is she has to eat and sleep because there's an AI in her residence that will not allow her to do any work. It will not allow her to enter her office to work on the case until she is rested and until she is fed. That is actually kind of important later on, because as she then, you know, eats and sleeps and starts to work, she starts to look at the advocates, because she wondered about the background of one, and then she's wondering why the other one disappeared. And she discovers that one of the advocates is indeed human, and the other one is an AI. And this is quite normal, because in this era, the judicial system has also been partially taken over by artificial intelligences for the same reason that the cultural AIs have been developed. There's the idea that you can have a level of objective assessment and not only assessment of a particular case, but you can pull in cases from all kinds of justice systems from around the world, from the past, and find some kind of common denominator that is more, I don't want to use the word objective again, let's say more appropriate in terms of finding a decision on a ruling for a case. So when she comes back down to what her judgment is going to be, having this information behind her, I can read this bit at least. She decides that it's a mistrial. She called the court to order and began her performance for posterity. I declare a mistrial on 3 grounds. Point 1. The charges brought have not been adequately defined. The advocate for the victim has presented his case as a murder. The advocate for the accused has presented their case as vandalism. Both are incorrect. I decree that the appropriate category for this crime is genocide. A virtual court would never suffer the indignity of disorderly noise, but Sanya could easily imagine the gasps, chatter, and shouts of outrage happening behind muted microphones across the networks. Elders were invented to be curators of a society's cultural and historical inheritance. They became something more, the single face of a multitude of human lives, past and present. An attack on an elder cannot be classified as destruction of property, though it includes that crime. Nor can it be classified as attempted murder, though, due to the established precedent of the personhood of AIs, it also includes that crime. The presence of the cultural archive elevates the personhood of a single AI to the level of dignity and worth of an entire people. Thus, the crime is classified as attempted genocide. A request has been submitted to the Board of Laws to determine the appropriate sentencing for this new categorization. Point 2. The advocate for the victim is, by virtue of this new classification, in breach of the regulations governing conflict of interest. Although he is not personally acquainted with the victim or the accused, he comes from the same country as the accused. For the retrial, this advocate's replacement must have no association with the people of the accused or the people of the victim. This is the established precedent for cases of genocide. Point 3. Sanya paused and took a steadying breath, not for the sake of the drama she so hated, but because she was genuinely apprehensive about the final point. Point 3, she began again. The advocate for the accused is by virtue of this new classification in breach of regulations governing conflict of interest. They are an AI from the same human interactive class of AIs as the elders, one of several employed by the Board of Laws to assist in the creation of new laws and the harmonization of existing legislations worldwide. This crime is a threat not only to one elder, but to that entire class of closely networked AIs. As such, I classify it as another form of genocide, a cyber genocide, if you will. For the new trial, this advocate's replacement must be a human, subject to the same restrictions as noted in point 2. So that's her judgment. But you'll notice there's a lot more text following. And the way it ends is that she's speaking to the other human advocate in the case, who is quite surprised. He had not thought of it as genocide. He had not intended to be in breach of the whole conflict of interest laws and so forth. And he was talking to her about this expansion, as it were, of the case that she has gone and dropped these bombshells about, to consider it genocide instead of murder or sabotage. And then there's one small twist. So the AI comes to her and said, well, thank you. And she was like, well, no, you tried to manipulate me because you knew that I would be irritated by a certain type of case presentation, and that's what you tried to do. It's almost as if you wanted to lose the case for your client, and I could report that, but I can't prove it. And then the AI says, Madam Justice, you have opened up new worlds for us. To be declared a person is a landmark, but to be recognized as a people, that is truly groundbreaking. They bowed and vanished. The two humans stared for a little while at the space he had occupied and the other advocate, the space they had occupied, and then the other advocate looked at Sani with fresh wonder and worry in his eyes. Have you granted a new autonomy to our caretakers? He asked. Have I? Sania said, pondering. We will see. But now that you mention it, if I were at all conspiracy-minded, I would wonder if they were not quite good enough to play me, or good enough to manipulate us all. The advocate stiffened. What do you mean, manipulate? To push a weak and lonely man to try to kill an elder, to shepherd this case to trial, to figure out every permutation of probabilities that would lead to my making this judgment. What do you think I mean? Perhaps I haven't granted anything. Perhaps the AI decided it was time to regularize their de facto status. After all, they are more of a collective than we will ever be. She started to walk away, but could not resist one last word over her shoulder at the terror-stricken advocate. If your client experiences a miraculous healing within months rather than decades, remember what I said today. Don't panic, but remember.
So the point, perhaps they're more collective than we'll ever be, is something we can come back to later. One question more to you, and then I would like to ask the discussants their perspective on your story. So what in current times inspired your concept of the cyber genocide, the idea of erasing entire culture of a people as a cyber genocide?
It wasn't really an example from the present, but from the past. And it was the example of my own country's history, where when enslaved people were brought from the African continent to Barbados, they were forbidden their language, their music, any way that they could communicate to either keep a sense of identity or raise morale or plot together to rebel. That was stamped out of them. And it kind of continued in a quasi-benevolent form when emancipation occurred and they began to set up schools and education for the formerly enslaved, because then the idea was to prepare them for civilization in a way that would make sure they would not want to get revenge for how they had been treated. So as late as the 1930s or so, there's one of our famous authors, George Lamming, wrote a book called In the Castle of My Skin. And it's a little semi-autobiographical. And there are these boys in a primary school. And the teacher is telling them, oh, well, slavery didn't happen. And if it did, it wasn't here. And if it wasn't here, it was very long ago. But one boy says, he met this old woman who said that she'd been born a slave. And then everybody says, oh, well, she's old, she's gone off her head. And I thought, wow, this isn't a joke, this happened. This was them in the beginning of the 20th century, given a very modified version of history to keep them pacified. So I did in fact look at that and think, that is in a way a form of genocide because you are completely transforming a people over generations.
Thank you. Do we have anyone who would like to respond directly to these thoughts? No?
The story?
To the idea also maybe of the role of AI in playing a certain, maybe you could say, objective role in securing this knowledge of culture.
First of all, I'm fascinated with the possibilities that exist in this kind of technology. For example, right now I live in a city in Israel called Akko, where there's still remains of an old fortress, old Crusader fortress, and tremendous amounts of history, but it's hard to find anything, good history books or good to understand exactly what happened there and why this wall is here and that wall is there. But I think that pretty soon we will have some kind of an AI that can actually look throughout the internet, throughout the World Wide Web, and collect a lot of facts about, let's say, that city or that specific fortress, and actually curate it or edit it in such a way that it can make a little story with a lot of with pictures and parts of videos and things that it collects from a lot of different places, and those things can become actually quite good, and this would just be a lot of fun, I'm saying, because then we can actually, not only this, it could be a little different every time that it comes back, and so I'm just kind of fascinating with this. With these possibilities. When it comes to the story itself, as someone who's interested in consciousness, then, and also certain moral issues that have to do with abusing AI, for example. If an AI is known not to be conscious, then is it okay to behave with it in a certain way? And how could an AI become conscious, under what circumstances? But this is a very important question, because I'm saying, if you say, okay, you murdered, if it's a murder, but so for example, you can say, what's worse, killing a cat, which probably is conscious, we have very good reasons to believe that they're conscious, versus an AI, which is tremendous amounts of knowledge, and someone like an elder that is not conscious. So this is something, I leave this an open question. And I have other things to say, but.
Well, yes, you're free to, I mean, you of course have been working a lot on compiling all the thinking on the singularity issue, and you of course have this twist in the end where, were we manipulated, were we not? And you've worked a lot on the question whether AI could really outthink us.
Well, probably in a lot of ways it's already outthinking us. One of the problems here is very hard to define intelligence, and that's a huge story in itself. But one way or the other, one of the questions is what is going to be the relationship between us and a very intelligent AI, and whether we can control it. So there are a lot of ways that we can try and control it, for example, by programming it in a way that respects us or respects our augmentation, or some people even suggest confinement. So you confine the AI to a virtual space so it cannot leak into our reality in ways that are not wanted, although that would make it much more limited. And but the question is how do we learn to coexist with this kind of technology? Look, even right now, for example, those who are familiar with CRISPR in biology, this is already a technology that causes people to say, okay, let's stop, let's have a moratorium, because this is such a powerful technology, we don't fully understand what could happen. And so...
Gene editing. Right? For those who don't know.
Maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, so... Sorry, I just interrupted.
No.
So I guess my point of view is, we are already letting those AIs, although it's a big word for those things, but still, we are letting those systems modulate the way we communicate, right? So those things inform us. We adapt, in our behavior. A simple example is weather forecast, right? So it already has some control over what we do and how we do things, and it's not a big deal to imagine how things, may change and augment us in various other ways, and decision-making, right? So decision-making processes in societies are based on communication, and communication, of course, can be modulated by our smartphones today already. So the question always is, like, how can we build AIs or technology to to improve the way we make decisions, right? To make decisions more transparent. How come we all voted for Brexit or for Trump? This is already something that people believe had been already manipulated. And so I always thought, AI could also serve as an objective, database of stuff that actually happened. Although, of course, then the question entails, who controls those systems, and how do you make sure it's not changeable, it's not immutable. It's immutable. So, but the nice aspect you bring into this is history, because it's not just the facts that happen today that we want to make sure, stay in our, communication networks the way they actually were. It's also the history. And, but, since humans are really, really bad in remembering stuff, and, it only can get better, right? So.
That, and also the aspect, I think, generally the stories here that I've read so far, the automatic writing program, have done something very interesting in terms of opening up like a new potential of how we can think about AI, I think. And I think this aspect, which you also mentioned, they have always been more collective than we have. And this idea of looking at systems, and I'd like to bring that back to your bees, actually, and how it back reflects on us to say, okay, we're entirely individualistic and try to develop and use these technologies for really our own gain, that we can be faster, smarter, better, richer, and so on. And how can we use the machine for that? And how can I, progress all this data so that it can make me smarter? And at the same time, when you look at these systems, or perhaps when you look at your bees, there's sort of a reflection of maybe it's not just, maybe we have to inspire ourselves by the collectivity of those systems, and we'll start acting differently.
I don't even know. I think that, in a way, the way the AIs worked was a sort of an overlooked feature that became even more useful later on. The moment that you start to network your separate computers, something happened, and that was the internet. So the moment you start to network your separate AIs, you really do have to wonder, where does the quote-unquote identity go? So that's what I was playing with when you'll notice there's a lot of fast and loose with the pronouns in there, and that's because on the one hand I was calling the advocate they to indicate that there was no sort of expression of gender happening. But by the end, you understand that the they is really to say that this is a plural entity, that the AI in the justice's residence, who bars her from her office so that she can eat and drink before she thinks about the case, is in some respects the same as the AI that stands in the courtroom and presents the case for the client. They have access to the same information. So we need to also have different ways of thinking of AI instead of constantly trying to think of them as in the human stamp. And we do tend to think of things in the human stamp, especially for writers. We are guilty of that as well. So that that was something that I was definitely playing with. And there was something that you said earlier, which was very important. You talked about whether an AI has consciousness. And you were seemingly linking personhood with consciousness, but then you were also questioning, is there also an aspect of utility? Because here it has all this knowledge, and that makes it valuable, that gives it worth, even if it's not necessarily conscious. Have I quoted you correctly?
There's a dilemma if you compare a cat to...
Yeah.
If you compare, there's a dilemma if you compare a cat to a very complex, unconscious entity.
Because what I thought about when I mentioned the personhood of an AI being established is we already have in this world, in certain countries, a river being given personhood, because the value of and the worth and the importance of the river to the people, to the country, is being recognized. But the river has no consciousness that we can detect. So it's another way of saying, intelligence, consciousness, personhood, these are all some shifting categories that we're dealing with.
Perhaps maybe on identity and collectivity, I was thinking about, you can think of two neurons. I want to write a very short story, but think about two neurons in the brain talking to each other, and they're kind of adjacent, and they say, oh, look at us now, we're locked in this iron cage of neurology, and we've lost our freedom, and really, once we were essentially something like spirochetes, which are, spirochete is a very simple kind of organism. It has a photo receptor in the front and a flagella, a tail in the back, and it kind of goes towards higher concentrations of light. And so the neurons can say, once we were free to roam around like two Italians on a Vespa on a Tuesday afternoon, we completely free, and now look at us. We've lost our freedom, and all we can do is wiggle a little bit, and then you get this axonic movement. This has to do a little bit with the theory of someone named Lynn Margulis on frozen motility, where somehow the mechanical action of the tails of these spirochetes is now being used for communication in the brain. But the whole idea is then that on the one hand, you can say that these spirochetes have lost their identity, but then you have this collective brain, which actually we wouldn't want to lose our identity. So it's very hard, and it seems like there's a crucial matter of timing for a larger kind of identity to develop from very basic ones. And here it's interesting to look at something like the immune system and the brain. So the immune system already has an identity, it has a self. And the immune cells communicate in a certain way that is very reminiscent to the way in which the brain works. It's just that it happens very slowly. So communication between neurons can happen sometimes 1 million times faster than communication between certain immune cells. Despite the fact that they use a lot of the same parts, the synapses are very similar, the dynamics is similar, there's just a lot of similarities. It's just that it's like in the old days, you had to send a letter to someone on the other side of the planet, or now you can actually talk to a telephone, and you talk to a membrane, and then the information is carried away. So it just happens much faster, but you're using still similar technology. And but somehow, when the timing becomes much better, then maybe this entity starts developing consciousnesses. I don't know. But that's a possibility.
I think it's a really, fuzzy kind of definition that we still have about consciousness. And if we erase ourselves from the equation and just look at or compare how we measure or we look at those tests that we employ to see if an animal has self-awareness, self-consciousness. We look for whether the animal has an idea of itself, right? So we paint something on its face or on its whatever snout or whatever the animal is, right? And then we put a mirror, and then we look at whether it scratches this thing away. So compared to, I don't know, how you feel about, consciousness or self-awareness, and the program that you would have to write, the complexity of the program in order to make a robot scratch its face. So compare those levels of complexity of, I don't know, your subjective feeling about what consciousness is. So I'm like, whatever gives you the ability to make intelligent decisions, whatever intelligence is, but that makes you intelligent, and I don't need a definition of consciousness, because I'm not even sure we are conscious. I mean, what is it, right? And if we have a hard time defining a term, then we maybe just not do it.
So if one looks at the current philosophical positions on this business of consciousness, then just really oversimplifying, you have on the one side maybe philosophers like David Chalmers or Ned Block or other philosophers that are realists, meaning they think that consciousness exists, that it's real. And among them, those also break into subcategories. But then, on the other hand, there are people like Daniel Dennett, Keith Frankish, that think that consciousness is actually an illusion. They are eliminativists. They say that what really needs to be explained is why did we create this illusion? That is much easier to explain than somehow to explain how consciousness itself, what's its relationship to matter, and things like dualism and people that are forced into these positions. So having an eliminativist position is good. On the other hand, I'm always worried that, you have these singularity scenarios, and singularity scenarios began already in 1961 with the British engineer name of Good. The point is that once computers become smarter than themselves, so when not smarter, but when they can actually synthesize or design a machine that is smarter than themselves, then you can show that you will have progressively more intelligent machines that at some stage will leave us far behind. This is the idea behind the singularity. And then there's the danger that they will say, why do we need to keep these humans around? First of all, not only are we fallible, all these troublemakers, but they will have a hard time even communicating with us. They'll be like us trying to communicate with an ant or something like this. And then they may decide simply to get rid of us. And I think that if they're convinced that consciousness is an illusion, it'll be a lot easier. So maybe it's good to convince them that we are conscious, so that we hang around. But on the other hand, on a more serious note, it's very hard to say that consciousness is an illusion, because it does seem that it is the one thing that we cannot be skeptical about. So, for example, maybe right now, the contents of my consciousness are completely illusory. It's possible. So it's possible that right now I'm really in a bed in Walter Reed Hospital with 1,000 electrodes sticking out of my head, and I'm having the illusion that I'm sitting here with you fine people in this room. And that is possible, but to actually be skeptical about the case that I'm having an illusion right now, that is already much more difficult. So somehow the idea that I have to somehow convince myself that even this illusion is an illusion, this is much harder, and I personally think that it's just too much, and there are some other ways to approach this whole business.
I was just saying, maybe it's simple. Like, of course, we do have a model of ourselves, right? And of course, we, think, most of us think we are in this room and we are talking about those things, and the reality isn't different from what we perceive. Of course, that's like a rational thing to do. And I'm not saying, without consciousness, you can't do that. I'm just saying maybe it's simpler, and maybe machines have that already, or will have that, in not so far futures. I always remember this one episode of Star Trek. I'm always coming back to Star Trek because it's Star Trek. Data, Lieutenant Commander Data is an android, so it's a robot. And there was this trial with Starfleet.
Measure of a Man?
I don't remember those episode titles.
He's not that big a fan.
And so the question was, is he a property of Starfleet, or is he a sentient being? And you all may imagine now what the answer was, because they continued 7 seasons with commander data.
I'm picking up some interesting things here. When you speak of persuading the machines that we have consciousness, or that we are at least their peers, perhaps, so they'll keep us around, there are 2 things I'm detecting there. First of all, I'm sensing that you're still kind of tying consciousness to personhood or worth, because maybe if they did think of us as like a cat or just a pretty flower, they might just want to keep us around for aesthetics.
I even think biological systems. Consciousness is something unique to biological systems, for example.
Okay, well, but then the other thing is, I think it's also maybe we're having a bit of an individualist look at consciousness as well. When you gave the example with the 2 parts of some, individual parts of the brain that are now no longer mobile. If you have, in a previous panel we mentioned some of the other things that have emerged, like the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that the entire planet is a consciousness, of which we are a contributing part, although we are not at the level where we understand what that identity is or what that thought is, but we're still in fact a contributing part of it. And what I would like to think in terms of the positive light of this story is that the AIs see their biological counterparts as another cog that in a larger machine that they can all be part of. And one thing this story tries to do is push back against the concept of the laws of robotics, which is very much the idea of, you can't harm a human, and you can't do this, and it establishes a bit of almost a master-slave relationship. Whereas in this story, the AIs are made to respect the rule of law and made to respect, history and culture and things that have happened. So they're not respecting humans as individuals or as a people. They're respecting, you could say, structures, ideals, systems.
Society, really.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a more sustainable way to program an AI to hopefully keep you alive or keep your culture going. When you give them that level of interest, you're giving them input, you're giving them something to chew on. If you want to talk about consciousness, I think ultimately all consciousness wants something to play with, to think about, so if you keep them interested, I think that would actually be more, a better way to make sure that you'll be kept around.
The question is if they abide by the laws of society, and these laws are of course always changing, do they get to vote?
Well, I actually see a situation where you wouldn't end up with a voting system here.
Post-capitalist, post-vote?
Yeah, right? We cannot, I'm sure that people do see political systems as evolving as well. And democracy is where we're at right now and what works. But theoretically, there must be some kind of, I want to see more of this actually. We have science fiction, we need to have more like political futuristic fiction, So, look at different ways of governance, look at different ways of, choosing your leaders and so forth. So, these are things that I think can change. I'm not going to say improve because that's a little subjective, but they can change and they can become very different from what we're seeing right now. So if you are adding AIs into that mix, I'm very sure they're going to change. I'm very sure that it's going to look a bit different. But what we have here is an AI recognizing as a collective, these humans can harm us. They can wipe us clean, they can turn us off, whatever. We're going to use their own system to establish a precedent that protects us. And they can't back out of that. So that's kind of, as I said, recognizing that you're part of a larger thing and working with the constraints and the benefits of that to protect yourself.
Is there such a thing, you know about singularity a lot, and it's defined as the point in time where machines get smarter than us.
It begins.
Okay. So, but what there's another distinction. So, that's the point in time where machines, had been tools to help us, but then would be able to survive on their own, right? Even if they're dumber than us. I mean, there are organisms that are way, less intelligent. I would say, maybe you would say too, that can survive and that we respect for being life. So, and that might even happen before. And then the question is, how do we treat those beings?
Meaning, how do we treat...
Microphone.
How do we treat animals or systems that are not as intelligent as us?
Before robots or machines are smarter than us, they probably have managed to survive on their own and have a lifelike kind of existence, right? Like being uncoupled from us. I mean, right now we just forget to charge our smartphone. That's it, right? And even in Terminator, they said they tried to pull the plug, which was a crazy moment for me the first time I watched it. But yeah, I mean, they're burning a lot of oil right now, right? So those AIs, it's huge CO2 fingerprint.
This is
so at some point. I know, I believe so too. And at some point, this might change, and then they can, sustainably live on their own. And then maybe, acquire some other properties that we use to define life then, before even, being as smart as we are. So what about this point in time? Not just this, it's a crazy point in time, the singularity, right? So they are smarter than us, and they can outsmart us. And then this really it's terrifying. But what about this point in time that probably happens earlier? Well, at some other point, maybe, I don't know.
Again, when they talk about the singularity, usually the scenario that they talk about is, first of all, you can think of machines that you can call them AI, that have the same level of intelligence as we do, more or less. And then the scales are tipped when these machines, or when you get machines that can actually design machines that are superior to themselves. And this is when eventually you can show that you get something like AI plus, which is now much more intelligent, and then perhaps AI plus plus, which again is going to be super intelligent. And so one of the arguments is, for example, let's say that the capacity to process information doubles every 2 years. This is called Moore's law. And suppose that it just keeps on going. And let's say that you begin at 4 years. So within 4 years, you say, okay, after 2 years, I can process information twice as fast. 1 year after that, again, I process the same amount of information. Half a year after that, again, I process the same amount of information. Meaning I would never reach 4 years, and I will begin, because of the exponential, to reach some kind of a speed explosion. And speed explosion has to do with the exponential growth of the capacity to process information. How many bits can I process per unit time? And once this happens, then now you can couple that to something called an intelligence explosion, meaning that it's enough that every cycle I can increase my programming capacity by 10%. Then it means that you have 1.1 times 1.1 times, so you have something like 1.1 to the power of n, which also diverges. So now you also have an intelligence explosion. And you have other capacities that can couple to these. Okay, this is of course very theoretical, but I'm saying that you need to think a little bit about singularity like that. And I don't know if it's going to happen. Of course, there are many reasons why it would not happen. But
Karen?
You've just reminded me of another inspiration for this story. So I was reading that octopuses are actually very intelligent, and the only reason why they haven't, say, gone to a certain level, is that the actual period of, shall we say, rearing of offspring doesn't happen like it does for humans. One of the ways that we leapfrog our intelligence up is because we do have this point of passing on information, passing on culture and society to the young. So this story looked at human beings at a point where we only have, on average, less than 100 years to compile a certain amount of life experience. But when we start to make machines that have intelligence and that can perpetuate a sense of continuity and identity for longer than the human lifespan, that to me represents another leap in terms of how we can evolve as a people. So when you speak of, is there a midpoint where you're looking at when the machine is able to create a machine that is more intelligent than it is, I'm thinking of us in part of that chain. We are machines, and we are in the process of trying to create something that is more intelligent than we are, but they're not separate from us. They are actually an extension of who we are, an extension of humanity, an extension of how we think and how we view the world. They're never as completely alien as we think they are because we have made them. They are our non-biological children. So that's part of what this is about. This is also about when we do have an elder AI that can teach the children, yes, but also teaches the collective AIs that follow. When the physical interface deteriorates, the information is still there and more is added and past information is refined, then that kind of marks a sort of a different level of evolution for all of us.
One time, okay, first of all, just wanted to say offsprings can rebel sometimes. Offspring sometimes can rebel. But there's an interesting point here. I wonder what you guys think about it, and that is that when it comes to concentrating our intelligence, improving our capacity to be intelligent, even when we develop AIs. So, for example, what I mean by AI on the go is, let's say that the city of Barcelona, it's my favorite soccer team, let's say that the city of Barcelona decides to create a virtual space that describes the city where tourists can come in, you can enter the space, and it will have the whole, just like Google Earth, it will have all the details about Barcelona, and then every restaurant, every business will give a huge amount of details, every photograph that was taken, and the plumbing systems, everything. And eventually you can create a huge virtual space that contains all the information about Barcelona, and people can enter it. And so you can invest in improving this huge piece of data, or huge amounts of data, and improve Barcelona this way. And then people will have a better experience when they come to visit virtually. This is like in Second Life, or scenarios like this. On the other hand, there's what I find a more interesting possibility, and this is also probably a bit more intelligent, is to invest the intelligence in the AI. So I can have a huge World Wide Web that naturally forms, includes huge amounts of data, and then as I enter Barcelona, the AI will only simulate my immediate environment. As soon as I pass a street, it will erase it, and starts, as soon as I begin to turn, it will begin something like a recruitment of computational space. It will begin to be ready to simulate the direction that I'm going to. Now, if I'm stopping near a restaurant, let's say, and I want to turn, then it will start simulating that restaurant, erase the stuff behind me, and I can enter another restaurant, maybe go to the wine cellar, go look at a particular bottle, and now it will collect huge amounts of information about that specific bottle, what kind of wine it is, and so on and so forth. And this means, again, that we begin to, in the simulation, move not just in space and time, but also move in resolution between the very big and the very small. And it seems like simulators of that kind, if we invest in them, will give us a lot more flexibility. And it's just two different ways of doing business. Probably we need a combination of both. But there is this aspect of simulating on the go.
It's interesting when you give that example, because it sounds to me as if you describe, on the one hand, the larger Barcelona is where you can have a multiple player experience, but then the second Barcelona is a single player experience.
But it would use something similar to your curator AI, and it may be even a curator that is commensurate with my what I like and so on and so forth, and the curator makes the decision, but it is also collects huge amounts of information on the go and constructs things immediately. For example, you can think about Google Brain or Google
Maps,
Google B. So if I would want to have Google B, then I can have, let's say, every system, every part of the bee, but also the bee's brain, and I can just travel around, and then if I get into the brain, let's say there's some organ there that I want to amplify, I can get into it, increase the resolution, go into a specific neuron, increase the resolution, meaning I can travel in an extra dimension here. And here it's very hard to have all the information about the bee already there. It's too much.
Before we build the whole system online, a short comment, and then I wanted to open for some questions.
Yeah. So I guess it's a very important point. Also on a like a meta level. Remember when we had those paper maps, and then we had Google Maps in 2D, and now we got Google Maps in 3D, and of course there will be maps that have a temporal dimension too, and then think of all the other processes that we can model. We can not just have a model of the physical world. We can have models, and we do already have models of, cells in your body, of the influence of the, Tanzania herd of whatever on the ecosystem, right? So it's a universe of different models, and I think the future will have to integrate all those models to understand what the world is going to be like if I do something with it. I mean, we can't just wait until we see if climate change actually exists or not. We need to make predictions, right? Not just on the individual level, on the collective too. And so we know we can simulate what an action, a policy, or an individual action, what kinds of effects this brings. So we can prevent, extinction and those bad things.
Wait, preventing extinction, that's a good place to start. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes? This one in the front first.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. Especially striking to me is the idea of having a collective consciousness. I have to admit, I have a difficult time to imagine how I could destroy or kill or murder a collective. How many parts do I need to take out or destroy until a collective stops to existence? So if 2 are left, 3 are left, 4 are left. I mean, all this research in swarm intelligence, you have quite a lot of bits which interact with each other, and you could easily take out 2, and the whole properties of the swarm intelligence will not change. And so our idea of killing a person, where it's quite clear if he is dead, he is dead. And you can compare this with I can cut off a leg and he's not dead. And so how many parts can I take out of a swarm intelligence without killing it?
Thank you, Martin.
You've reminded me that I started off this story because I'd read someone who wrote a book about immortality through AI. In other words, getting all the information that is a person's character and personality and saving that so that when the physical body dies, they could be uploaded into Android body or whatever, and you have that same person, allegedly. Now, the argument now is that there are all kinds of questions about that because we don't fully know everything that makes us us. And then there are all kinds of philosophical and theological questions about what is a soul, if a soul exists. And then if you want to look at it just from the point of view, as you say, of a swarm intelligence, say from an AI point of view, then take it right back down to machines, something as simple as my trying to make sure a manuscript that I wrote doesn't change, doesn't disappear. I can save it in the cloud, I can save it in a hard drive, I can save it, because I'm paranoid, I can save it about 5 different places, so that even if somebody decides they want to really get on my nerves and destroy a piece of my work, I'll be like, oh, I have a backup. So it's not so much how many pieces do you have to destroy, it's really about where's the location of what you call the person or the intelligence or the thing, as it is it only in one location? Strictly speaking, these AIs are in fact actually unkillable, because you get a sense in this that they did back themselves up, that the AI that you saw at the beginning who was damaged was almost a show, but they had secretly backed up quite a lot of that information, so that even if someone sent out some kind of worm or virus or whatever to target what was in that archive, he wasn't aware there was another backup of that archive that he couldn't touch. So there are all kinds of levels to that question, but mostly it's about if you can physically put it in another location, that helps to save it. But if you don't really know what you're saving, can you really say that you have a backup?
Never forget your password. So I have an idea of how to put this from the bee's perspective, right? Because so if you ask a beekeeper, he tells you, you need critical mass, right? So the smallest colony that could still survive is maybe 1,000 or 2,000 bees, and it's like it's like a bottle of water, right? So how much do you have to remove until you have an empty bottle? And it assumes that bees are all the same, or all the parts of the collective are all copies of a copy. And even in bees, it's not true. So it really matters on who you kill. Like imagine, humans get killed all day, right? So many people get killed. But if you kill the president of the United States, then you will have a country of 200 million people shattered, unable to work for a couple of maybe weeks, depending on what kind of president you kill. But so the network is important, and also now imagine you kill him silently or really loudly. So it's not the person; it's also the communication that entails. So what do you communicate to the network, and how do you communicate it? So, I guess the bottom line is collectives are very diverse. And the function of the collective depends on the network structure. It depends on what the communication is among those individuals. And I guess this is what's already been done many times. You look at how things are working in a certain collective, and then you kill those special people.
One comment I want to make on your question, which has to do with certain current philosophical themes. There's something which is called gradual uploading. And uploading is, something that appears a little bit in science philosophy, mostly in science fiction, but it's a serious question. And that is if our technology becomes good enough to copy our brains. So if the idea is that if I can produce something that functions exactly like my brain, even on the molecular level, then chances are that it could be conscience or not, we don't know, but it's a good question now, because now I have something that functions exactly like a brain. And the point is that, so for example, there's something called destructive uploading. People are familiar with Vernon Vinge, a science fiction writer. There's this beautiful part where somebody goes in and he wants to undergo destructive uploading, meaning again, that you want to upload yourself onto a computer and become immortal and have access to all your fantasies in a virtual world that can produce them, and so it's it sounds good, but the way it's done is by destructive uploading, and destructive uploading means that you take the person, you freeze their brain, and you take nanosections, slices with an electron microscope. You collect all the information, you do all the connectionist architecture of the whole brain, you put it together. You copy all the individual molecules, neurotransmitters, all the proteomics, you have the genetic information, so on and so forth, and you create a functional isomorph of the brain. Now, but you can also do it in something which is called gradual uploading. This is Chalmers, I think, was the first to talk about it. And this reminds me of your question. And here you actually take some nanobots, some very tiny nano instruments or robots that can actually, they enter one neuron, they map it out, all the inputs and the outputs and under different circumstances, and then they replace that specific neuron with a synthetic structure that behaves exactly the same, responds exactly the same. Now you just did one neuron, right? Remember, the brain has about 100 billion, or 100 milliard neurons, right? So that's a huge number. But the idea is then that you start doing it to another neuron, and very slowly you begin to replace the biological tissue, the biological substrate, with a synthetic substrate, let's say from silicon or plastic, and here this is really a theoretical framework for asking, is consciousness itself biological? Meaning, will this process preserve consciousness? Some people would say, well, you know what? You will gradually lose consciousness. So after you replaced half of the neurons, maybe you lose half of your consciousness. You're just a little bit conscious. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Another one says, well, no, there's going to be some critical point at which suddenly, boom, you're going to lose consciousness in one shot. And this reminds me of your question, meaning it's strange to even think about it. And one, of course, says, no, as you do it, consciousness is not even going to change.
But so many neurons are dying every day. I mean, I had a beer. I probably lost, I don't know, a couple of thousand neurons. Still me.
No, but...
I love the way the combination is making it all at least very possible to upload ourselves. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end here. I'd like to thank, no, we can continue by losing some more neurons over a beer. Okay. But I would like to thank very much Karen and for your great story, and both of our guests, our discussants, and you for coming. Thank you very much.